Chapter 4 tackled the pacification and exploitation done by the Spanish colonizers to Filipinos. And here we ask, where did the cruelties of the Spanish colonization originate? The pacification and exploitations occurred from the system created by Spain called encomienda, and its original purpose was actually to reduce the abuses rooted from forced labor. Encomenderos were supposed to look after the natives and give them education, but instead, they ignored these duties and treated the natives as if they were their slaves. Despite the limitations ruled over the encomenderos, abuses remained rampant and the system was characterized around greed and cruelty. The encomenderos became instruments of pacification and exploitation, where they found ways of abuse through tributes, forced labor, bandala, and military conscription, wherein those who failed to do as they're told were tortured, imprisoned, or had their houses looted and burnt down. This system that became centered around greed caused hindrances for the economic development of the country. The abuse of power used by Spaniards against the people is why there was only little economic development despite them colonizing the Philippines for 333 years.
In this chapter, the elephant in the room are the abuses of the encomienda system. Basically, when Spanish explorers would venture forth and find unexplored lands with natives, such as the Philippines back then, they would be able to obtain a right for them to manage that land. And that's where the encomienda system comes into play. In simple terms, the premise of the encomienda system is an equally good deal for both the natives and the Spanish conquerors. The natives would receive religion, education, protection, and other forms of help from the Spaniards, and in return, the Spaniards would receive tributes and be able to order and sort of guide the natives. However, before we talk about why it all went wrong, let's talk about why the Spaniards even bothered exploring the ocean in search of unexplored lands in the first place. Because for sure, they're not doing it out of curiosity or because they have a knack for adventure. These Spanish explorers just really like money, and they're getting paid a lot of money if they end up discovering unexplored lands. In fact, everybody wanted to get paid, even the Spanish royals who gave out orders for the exploration. Now, this is why the encomienda system is important to these people. It's a system that can make them get even more money. Because these explorers were money driven to begin with, being able to obtain a system that gives you a concurrent payout just ensures financial stability for them. So, what ended up happening is that these Spanish explorers who led these encomiendas, or in other words, they're called encomenderos, these encomenderos abused the system in order to line their own pockets. But the crown also wants money. That's why they established the system. So they imposed some restrictions. First, they restricted the value of tributes the encomendero can receive to only about 1/4 of the total value of the tributes. Second, they made sure that the encomenderos led the natives so that they could develop as a society and end up making more money for all of the Spaniards. But the system is fundamentally flawed, and this is why it was able to be abused by the encomenderos. While these flaws are not explicitly mentioned in the reading, we were able to identify them. Firstly, the people who are managing the encomienda were the encomenderos, as I stated before, who were people who voyaged to uncharted lands because they wanted money. So there was a high likelihood for these people to be corrupt and only desire money. And that's exactly what happened. These encomenderos were embezzling tributes in order to get richer, and this was a hard problem to address by the crown. There were no practical solutions to solve the problem. So here are the solutions they tried. First, they tried sending out people to monitor the encomenderos to ensure that there was no corruption happening. But these people they sent out were also corrupted and were also receiving a share of the tributes in order to keep quiet about the issue. The normal response then would be to send out people who wouldn't benefit from the embezzlement, such as Spanish royals. But it's highly unlikely for royals to position themselves away from Spain, where they would receive less protection in exchange for extra money when they already have a lot of money. This was a big deal because other powers like the Portuguese and the Dutch were also voyaging to uncharted territory. On top of all that, Portugal and Spain weren't on good terms, and they even experienced a few skirmishes during this time. A notable one being in Cebu in both 1567 and 1570. All these factors together allowed the encomenderos and the corrupt government officials to receive most of the tributes themselves, while only giving a much smaller portion to Spain and the Catholic Church. While Spain experiences all these problems, the natives were also being abused and tormented constantly. Had the system worked the way it was intended, it's almost guaranteed that history would have changed for the better. Filipinos had society and governments before our colonization, but the technologies the Spanish had were more refined and developed. Had we been taught the same quality education or weren't treated as slaves, our country would have developed in a much better way. And while this wasn't specified explicitly in the reading, my personal analysis on why the Philippines wasn't developing quickly despite receiving some education from the Spaniards was because the encomenderos and the government officials weren't incentivized to build a good foundation for the Philippines in the long term. As far as they were concerned, this was just another way for them to gather money or to gain a lot of profit, whether it be from the tributes or payment from Spain in exchange for managing their colony. Even if you argue that these Spaniards could settle in the Philippines and have their families stationed here, they would still be incentivized to only develop the areas under their jurisdiction and find the best way to make the most amount of money. Because in the end, the land belongs to the crown, and they will return it eventually as heredity for ownership only spans for 2 generations, and on the 3rd generation, it will inevitably return to the ownership of the crown. It's even worse for the government officials because they can be reassigned to a different region or instructed to return to Spain at any time. All of these factors combined disincentivizes them to actually seek the best for the Philippines in the distant future. So what ended up happening is exactly what you would expect. The Spaniards would implement policies that maximize production, such as forcing labor onto all men within working age for a set amount of days per year, specifically catering to the Spaniards who did way less work than the Filipinos. Or to even impose quotas so that the Spaniards who treated the Filipinos like slaves would consistently push themselves all for the financial stability of the Spaniards. The saddest part about all of this is that despite the abuse, Filipinos couldn't rebel against the Spaniards because they were a much smaller force. Even before the Spaniards came, the Philippines were divided into different barangays, and these different barangays even fought and clashed with each other. The Spaniards were able to take advantage of this and recruit Filipinos from different barangays as their military force to take down Filipino rebels in different and various regions. The chapter was named Pacification and Exploitation, and given everything that happened, that isn't too far off from the truth. This chapter was all about how the Spanish were able to control and exploit the Filipino natives. But the important thing to note here is that there was absolutely no way this wouldn't have ended in disaster for the natives. If you think about it, the voyages were made because the people involved were seeking profit. Helping the natives was never the first priority in their minds. Because of that, the results were expected to begin with. This will also be talked about in the next chapter, where the Spaniards were thinking about abandoning the Philippines simply because they didn't obtain as much profit as they would have expected, because they compared the Philippines to other lands they recently discovered, like the South Americas, which had lots of gold and other valuable resources. But I mentioned that the Filipinos were being abused, and yet the Filipinos were even enforcing it onto themselves. I think the reason some of the Filipinos were so loyal was because they were blinded by what was in front of them. These encomenderos or officials could pay these Filipinos a very small portion of what they earn from the abuse, and these Filipinos would gladly take it because they failed to visualize the bigger picture. My interpretation is that what went on back then was similar to the corruption that goes on today in different parts of the globe. My interpretation of what went on back then was similar to the corruption that goes on today in different parts around the globe. There's a superpower that can help make you, your family, and your friends rich, but that condition is contingent on the fact that you protect them and let them do their business. To cite a real world example where this actually happens, there's a similar scenario with Shell and Nigeria. The YouTuber Jake Tran made a video on this topic. If you're interested, you could watch it yourself. This hypothesis of mine would probably explain why the military force that was primarily consist of Filipinos were willing to obey orders from the encomenderos and the government authorities. I also think that this was where economic inequalities began to show up in the Philippines greatly. With the Spaniards abusing the majority and favoring a select minority, this minority would probably go on to have a lot more riches and is way more likely to have relationships with the Spaniards. I think this would probably explain why some rich Filipinos seem to have more Spanish or foreign blood in them compared to the average Filipino. But this is just my speculation, and there's no way to know for sure. What we do know, however, is that the people eventually led a successful revolution and kicked out the Spaniards out of our country. How this happened, despite the systems and rigorous safety checks the Spaniards made in our country, is a mystery for now, but will probably be talked about in the later chapters of the book. My two guesses for now is that 1. The population grew exponentially such that the minority who protected the Spaniards could no longer fend off the larger population by themselves, while the Spaniards were unwilling to share more of their profits because they couldn't sustain a profit any longer. And 2, because the foundations the first encomenderos laid out were bad, since it tried achieving as much profit as possible in a short period of time, the economy didn't grow large enough for it to be considered a gold mine by the Spaniards, given all the other external factors and issues they're also probably facing in Spain. So my guess is that they reduced the priority of the Philippines and their control became weak enough such that a revolution was successful. Just take this speculation of mine with a grain of salt. In the end, I think it's interesting to find out that most of what could go wrong went wrong for both the Spaniards and the natives. The native Filipinos were faced with a threat that could cause a lot of damage if they went against them, and the Spaniards, blinded by their own greed, put utmost priority on the systems that could make them rich but ended up with an unsustainable solution that could safely secure their own protection for the long term.
Chapter 5 discussed the economic and political structure of the Philippines, as well as the role of the Chinese during the Spanish colonization. The Philippines was primarily used by the Spaniards as a missionary and military outpost for their conquest on the neighboring nations such as China and Japan. However, the economic development of the Philippines was neglected and underdeveloped for 200 years due to the country being designated as a transshipment port for galleon trades between China and Mexico, which only involved Spaniards who were residing in Manila. Along with this, the agricultural potential of the colony was neglected and remained undeveloped. At one point, proposals to abandon the Philippines were raised because the colony was not self-supporting, which honestly seems ironic as in the first place, they refused to develop the agricultural potential of a tropical country which had a lot of agricultural resources that could have been utilized and used for economic development. And well, economic development is one of the factors that is needed in order for a country to be self-supporting. Also, in the first place, aside from spreading the religion, weren't they originally in the Philippines for its resources? but instead they focused on the galleon trading of Chinese and Mexican resources and completely ignored the resources found in the colony. Now, three distinct economic systems existed in the Philippines at the time, namely the Western economy, native economy, and the Chinese economy. But in these systems, Chinese goods and Mexican silver were the primary traded products, and native products were neglected, resulting to the native economy to be undeveloped. Plus, the Chinese also had its role on the economic deterioration of rural areas where natives, instead of planting rice and weaving their cloth, proceeded to buy their staples from the Chinese, and the Chinese became competition to the locals in the provinces, which drove them away from their occupations as local weavers. However, the Chinese also played a significant role in being intermediaries between the Westerns and the natives, as they distributed imports to the natives and distributed local products to the Spaniards, which pretty much helped the local economy as the Chinese gathered local products, making them have a vital role on the development of the primitive economy of the natives. The neglect on the Philippines' native economy was rooted on the administrative system that Spain was trying to incorporate to the Filipinos, which they firmly rejected. They tried implementing the reduccionist system to consolidate population in larger villages, though this system was not logical for the natives since they needed to live close to where they have their livelihood. However, the friars, in order to move the natives, used all means to make it happen, from titles and honors for the chieftains to threats and pressures if enticements were insufficient. Now, these attempts at implementing the reductionist system were to some extent effective, but Filipinos firmly opposed the system, which caused delays, resulting to the implementation of the poblacion barrio sitio system, where instead of moving population to larger villages, smaller communities within the population were established, with the center being the church or the cabecera. The implementation of this system was accomplished through the chiefs moving to cabeceras, which would set an example for others. They were able to convince the chiefs to move by giving them political authority as principales that gave them colonial recognition. This sparked the availability of political authority for Filipinos, introducing the gobernadorcillo as the highest position open to Filipinos. However, in exchange for the colonial recognition, consequences for the community's failure to pay tributes were delivered to the gobernadorcillo by a fine or imprisonment, but the powers of the gobernadorcillo was still susceptible to abuse and could still be used for one's personal benefit. The principales also had economic power, and they used this to take advantage of the concept of private property introduced by the Spaniards, as during the pre-colonial period of barangays, land was communally owned and was not a measure of wealth. But because of the introduction of Spaniards to the concept of land as a source of wealth, the natives had changed their way of thinking. Which makes us think, what would have happened if this concept was not introduced to the natives? Would there still have been a lack of consciousness on national solidarity as stated in Chapter 4? Because if the natives remained communally connected with each other, it's possible that the divide and rule tactic that the Spaniards applied to the Philippines could have not worked, and natives would not have been pitted against each other, shifting the course of history. With the economic and political standing being the source of social prestige, we could say that this could have been the reason as to why the chieftains, turned Filipino principales and gobernadorcillos, submitted to the Spaniards and formed somewhat an alliance with them by being intermediaries for the Spaniards and the natives, which honestly, I think is something that we cannot blame them on. I mean, imagine being colonized for hundreds of years, thinking that at that point the country will not be liberated and colonizers would stay permanently. You could think that the best course of action in order for them to survive was probably to submit and join their ranks. But at the same time, there were those who took advantage of the fact that they were exempted from tributes and whose desire for self-gain took over. This chapter displayed the tremendous impact and influence of the Spanish colonization to the Philippines. It also displayed how the Spaniards exercised their power on all aspects of society, such as the social, political, and economic power. The influence of the Spaniards can be seen through the tyranny influenced Filipinos. Due to the concept of land ownership that the Spaniards introduced to the natives, sadly, It led them into taking advantage of their own people through their positions as principales and gobernadorcillos. We can also see in this chapter the first efforts of Filipinos in opposing the Spaniards, with the full implementation of the reduction being unsuccessful. Spanish influence could have been a stronger force if the reduction system was successfully implemented, as the natives would be more easily controlled and observed by the administrators, which could possibly lead to future revolts to not occur.
Chapter 6 of A Past Revisited is named Monastic Supremacy because this chapter talks about how the priests, nuns, or people from the monastery became one of the biggest powerhouses and authorities in the Philippines. The Spanish Empire at the time had its power divided into the church and the state, which meant that the crown couldn't simply do whatever they wanted, and they still had to make sure that the church allowed for that action. They do this because their empire was said to be in service for both God and the Spanish king, or in simpler terms, the empire was a dual authority. If you recall back in chapter 4, one of the things the Spaniards gave the Filipinos was religion, aka Roman Catholicism. And the people indoctrinating the native Filipinos had to be the most qualified people for the job, and those were the priests. So, a large number of priests had to go to the Philippines in order to make sure that there were people who were able to spread the religion to the ever-growing colonies of the Spanish. But they were faced with a problem. There were no places for the priests to stay because they weren't allowed to own property. So, the church protested and ended up lifting the restriction, and priests were now able to own property in the Philippines. This resulted in a downward spiral that incentivized the Spaniards to pursue being a priest as a financial career. Because priests don't exactly have a way to earn money, their property had to be given to them by someone else, which meant free real estate. This someone was the crown. Second, there were more and more barangays being discovered, so they kept needing more priests. This meant that people thought about becoming priests, and that the Spaniards needed more priests in the Philippines. So, what they did is that they lowered the amount of years you study before becoming a priest. While it wasn't stated why this had to be done, despite the fact that more people were already thinking about becoming priests for the economic and political power opportunities, I thought of a few reasons why they had to do this. One, if you become a priest, there's no going back. You can't quit being a priest because you made an oath to God and the church, which happened to have a large power in the Spanish Empire. Second, even if you did become a priest, there was no guarantee you'll be assigned to the Philippines. Why would they send a freshly ordained priest when they can send a more senior one to the Philippines? Third, there were already priests who received properties through royal bequest, or in simpler terms, already given by royalty. If they wanted to, they could just make a priest accompany another priest within that same property, and this reason was also mentioned in the book. Moving on, let's talk about how the priests obtained power. Roman Catholicism is structured in a way that priests have to be treated by the Catholics in a very respected manner. By preaching faith, the priests were also consolidating power in a way, and this led to the priests becoming more powerful than the encomenderos, the people managing the colony themselves. The priests started to become corrupt, and they no longer followed the ideals of being a priest. And we know this was happening because the friars did everything in their power to prevent other religions from being spread in the Philippines, because they know that their power stems from what the people believe. They also did their best to obtain money because the properties they received were too much for them. They allowed the renting of their properties and became landlords themselves. So what they did was that they ended up manipulating farmers into debt traps, and that caused them to obtain even more property, and it just kept on getting worse. My take on the subject is that it could have been handled better by the empire. At some point, the abuse got too much that the people were able to realize that they were not being exploited alone. Their entire community was. And that led to revolutions and outrage from the people. I'm fairly confident that if the friars were able to do their jobs properly and didn't succumb to the greed and potential for getting rich, we wouldn't have that much religious diversity of Christianity in the Philippines. In our country, we have a lot of different branches of Christianity with different variations, such as, for example, some of them not believing in the priests or religious traditions, but instead purely on sacred scripture. The priests tainted the image of the church to those who realized the abuse, and that damage carries on until today. While the author thinks that this was because the priests got too greedy, I think the blame isn't entirely on them. If you think about it in the perspective of the friars, you just got sent to a faraway land that nobody you know knew even existed. The people there are humans without a doubt, but they don't look exactly like the people you're used to. And now, you're expected to preach your faith under conditions horrible enough to be compared to a punishment more than an opportunity. It's understandable that the friars' morale would be low, and then they would suddenly receive economic and political power when they're so used to having nothing. To expect these priests to do their job properly despite all of that is close to being unreasonable. I think the author was great in being objective in this chapter and describing what likely happened. I think it's better to delve in deep and understand their motivations behind their actions.
Chapters 4, 5, and 6 discussed the influences and changes implemented by Spain within the society of the Philippines. The early age of colonization brought upon the country a different system because of how the Spanish occupants viewed the native Filipinos. The Spaniards brought their culture, system, and religion with them and implemented it to the Filipino natives. Friars were at the top of the hierarchy, which at the same time made them the most abusive and corrupt Spanish authorities. However, despite all the changes they implemented in the Philippines, the economy and society was barely developed as they only saw the country as a trading route through Asia. Plus, due to the Philippines archipelago, the Spaniards had spent more for expenses than they profited during expeditions which ultimately caused them to almost abandon the country. With friars being the top of the authority, the church was one of the main driving forces during the Spanish colonization. Christianization was spread throughout the country and became an integral part of society, wherein 5 religious orders in the Philippines rivaled each other on increasing their influences. Friars played a vital role during the conquest of the Spaniards, as their influence and power allowed them to abuse their authority over the natives. The injustices and maltreatments experienced by the Filipinos in the hands of the friars before is not something to be ignored or forgotten.